Brian Busby is a literary historian.
From Montreal, Quebec. And I always think of myself as Montreal, but I come from St. Mary's in Ontario, small town. That's where I ended up 4 years ago. Yeah.
And that's where you live.
That's where I live.
Welcome to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much.
We're going to talk about Montreal, even though you don't live there. You do seem to focus on it.
Definitely. It was my home. I was born there. I was raised there. My parents are from there. And it's really the place I'll always consider home. And I expect one day I'll return to Montreal to live.
We were talking about the fact that it isn't really a city of plaques. Authors who have lived and worked and written about the city haven't really been acknowledged in a physical sort of way.
No, and it's interesting. I think if you're somebody who has been to London, for example, you can't help but miss the blue plaques. And they're a wonderful way to really explore history because, of course, sometimes you see a blue plaque and, I see Jimi Hendrix lived here when he lived in London. Another time you'll see a blue plaque and you don't know the person who's being honored. So, of course, then you look him up. And that's a wonderful way to really have a sense of history and continuity. Like that. There are a few plaques in Montreal. Most of them have nothing to do with writers, big political figures, and people like that. When I was working on my most recent book, which is a biography of John Glassco,
Canadian poet,
Montrealer, one of the things I wanted to do, of course, was to find out where he'd lived and just little things like that. So I have very specific addresses I'd written down, and I'd go and look at them. But before I went on that specific tour, I began at McGill, which holds about a third of his papers. He attended McGill, and as I say, it holds a third of its papers in its rare book room.
Which is a worthwhile literary destination
in
itself.
It's wonderful.
Yeah.
And one need not have an appointment or ask for material in advance. You can actually go there and ask for the material, and they'll bring it to you. They don't have to go to someplace off the island of Montreal to a big warehouse and get it and bring it back. But the interesting thing about that specific trip was that I spent the day at McGill going through his papers, and then I met a friend for a drink at a pub, and then the next time I was in town was the time I went searching to find out where he'd lived. And sure enough, it turned out that for about 6 years he had a pied-à-terre in Montreal. He also had a house in the country, so he had a little Montreal apartment for a period of about 6 years. That very address has since been turned into the pub I was drinking in with a friend on my previous visit. So I was actually drinking in John Glassco's apartment in a very roundabout way, not knowing it.
What's the name of the pub, by the way?
It was called O'Regan's, and in true Montreal tradition, O'Regan's has vanished, and it's now a pub called Fiddler's Green on Bishop Street. One of the nice things about that pub is that it is just down the street from St. James the Apostle Anglican Church. It's the corner of St. Catherine and Bishop, and that is where the Writers' Chapel is, and we were talking about plaques. And for the centenary of Glasgow's birth, I got together with one of Glasgow's good friends, Michael Narowski, and we decided we would honor him with a plaque because there is no memorial to him. He was cremated, his ashes were sprinkled in a stream. No one's even sure exactly which stream it is, but it was one that ran through his property. This is in Foster, in the eastern township, south of Montreal. And so there was no memorial to the man, so we kind of played around with the idea of we would have a plaque cast, and where would we have it put up, and whom would we ask? And we thought of McGill. He hated McGill, so that might not have been the right place. We thought of the house he lived in and died in Montreal, but it's a private residence. One never knows, It's because it's not part of a program by the city. Another owner could buy the house and say, I don't want that thing on it. And also we thought it's not a street a lot of people walk along, so not a lot of people would see this plaque. And so then we decided to put it in St. James the Apostle and approach them. The reason we chose St. James the Apostle is that it was his childhood church, and it was a church of his parents as well, and his grandparents. And he did consider himself an Anglican. He was a naughty boy, but he was an Anglican.
Do they allow for confession or not?
I think you're not obliged. You can always confess.
Yes. And then go out again and,
Yes, but anyway, he was married there both times. Funeral was there. And we thought it would be a wonderful idea. So we approached them, and we had a wonderful evening with a lot of Glassco's friends. A lot of his old Montreal friends came. And
when did he die?
He died in 1981, born in 1909. What we did was we had this wonderful evening. It was such a success that Michael Narowski thought we should do this again. And the church was all for it. So the next year we honored H.A.M. Smith with a plaque, and it was the 30th anniversary of Smith's death.
So another poet, editor.
He was another poet. It was a perfect pairing, I thought, because Smith was Glassco's mentor. And in the book, I don't think I say it in so many words, but in the biography I wrote, it becomes clear that to me, Smith was the mentor Glassco always should have had. And if you look at Glassco's life, the first half is relative silence in terms of writing. It was only about sometime around his 50th year that a flurry of activity happened, and a lot of that was Smith's influence.
Smith again was he a lawyer as well?
You might be thinking of Scott, because people often pair Scott with Smith.
Yeah.
Scott was a constitutional lawyer. He was dean of the Faculty of Law at McGill, and he was a poet. And Scott and Smith were the early, they were the big champions of modernism in poetry, and they were all friends of Glassco's. It's nice that you brought him up, because the next year we did Scott. And that year, third year, which is the most recent year, it was last October, there was a very big ceremony with the Bishop of Montreal, and it was actually quite touching. At the end, we all crammed into the chapel. The ceremony was in the big church, and then we all crammed into the chapel, and he officially dedicated this chapel that was over 100 years old and never had a name as the Writers' Chapel. So now it's officially the Writers' Chapel, and this coming year will be, this year in October, will be honoring Hugh MacLennan. The idea is to honor Montreal writers, and they need not be English, they need not be Anglican. The idea is to honor the writers from our past.
Could you speak to that, the importance of having a physical location at which these writers are celebrated?
I like the idea of a central location. I think that's a wonderful thing. To see these plaques, now granted right now there are 3, but if everything goes according to plan, in 100 years there'll be 103 of them, and you'll really see this gathering of Montreal names. So it makes you more aware of the literary history. The other thing is, I would love to see more plaques on buildings. But as you see, for example, with O'Regan's, which is now Fiddler's Green, when we were there initially celebrating Glassco's life, we finished off at the Writers' Chapel. We all went for a drink at O'Regan's, of course, because that was his apartment.
Watering hole.
Yeah. Well, was it? It was his private watering hole, because it was his apartment. But the thing about that was, then we thought, O'Regan's should have a plaque, and maybe we could even talk to them about that. And you realize, yes, and if we'd done that, then a new owner would have come along and thought, what's this? And either they would have wanted to keep it up, or they wouldn't have. And then it would be lost. That's one of the problems.
Unless it's a historically...
unless it's protected.
Yes.
Yes, because there are, the blue plaques. You can't buy a building in London and say, well, I don't like that blue plaque, I'm taking it down. Because
or tear the building down, for that matter.
No, you can't tear the building down. And actually, it's funny you say that, because one of the things is, once you put a plaque up, there's some history. And if you just walk down St. Catherine Street a few blocks, there was... this isn't necessarily a literary thing that I'm talking about here, but a few blocks down the street, there was a theater called the Seville. And the Seville was a true theater that was turned into a movie theater. But the people who played on its stage were people like Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald and Count Basie and people like that. And I knew it as a repertory theater. It was actually quite nice inside, marble and everything else. Then it was bought by a developer. It was closed down. He wanted to turn it into condos. The city fought against him on that. They wouldn't let him demolish it. So he did, in true Montreal style, what developers do when they want to demolish a building, is they take everything of value out of the inside, they punch some holes in the ceiling, they turn on the water, they let the pipes burst, they destroy the building, and it took a long while. It was a very well-made building, but it took a long while for him to get permission to demolish it. It was about 20 years. in the meantime, one of the walls fell on a side street, and all these things were happening. And my argument, and this is why I think I have my own thoughts against development, so it perhaps taints the way I view things, but my argument would be, if you have a plaque on a building and it says, Count Basie played here, Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, it's going to be a lot harder to rip down that building because the public has a greater sense of the history of this building and a greater appreciation. And to me, the idea of continuity in history is very important. And when you destroy things, you lose so much of that. You lose so much of the soul of the city. And I guess I would love to see the city do something like this. And it's something we haven't approached the city on.
Just to follow on to that, I've just finished reading Charlie Foran's biography of Mordecai Richler, and made a point of going to see Walensky's, which is still standing and still operating. At the very end of the book, he makes mention of Mordecai's wife, who's still living, and she has had a bench built across from his grave, and she's planted a mulberry bush. And so I visited that site, and it really was moving and poetic and a beautiful way to muse on and celebrate one of our great writers.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I do like the idea of that kind of making a bit of a pilgrimage. Glassco and Richler knew each other, and they used to go together to a restaurant that's still around called Les Mas, and it's just down from Fiddler's Green. So, with a bit of research, you can draw a really nice walking tour of that area of Montreal, because Richler used to drink on Bishop's just up the street, and people's paths would cross. And, even though they're no longer with us, we can see what they appreciated.
Well, thanks very much for doing the work that you're doing.
It's a labor of love. And I have to say, I never think of it as work, because it's so interesting, almost like the continuity of one's education, and it's good fun.
Well, and what you're doing is, I think, is a service to Canadian culture for future generations. So thanks for talking about it.
Thank you.
I've been speaking with Brian Busby, who is a literary historian who lives in St. Mary's, Ontario, but who has a love for all things Montreal. Thanks again.
Thank you.